Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Global Journalism Seminar at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism in Oxford. I'm Mira Selfer, Director of the Journalist Fellowship Programme here and Deputy Director of the Institute. We run this seminar series to talk about the challenges facing journalism, and this term in particular, I've really focused on getting reporters from the field to talk about their experience in telling some of the most important stories in the world. And there are a few right now more important stories than that of Ethiopia. One of the oldest countries in the world, Africa's second most populous nation. This is an utterly critical moment for the country. This morning, the UK, US and other embassies in Ethiopia called for an immediate ceasefire to prevent famine in Tigray. The country, one with so much potential, so much hope, is at the tipping point. And I'm really glad we've got journalist Samuel Getachew with us today to talk about journalism in a conflict zone, journalism in a nascent democracy, and to talk about what it means to tell the story of people whose voices cannot be heard. I'd like to say two things before I start, which is that I was based in Kenya as Africa correspondent for a British newspaper for several years, and Ethiopia was flat out my favorite country to visit. I went to report at every opportunity I could get. I'm also from Sri Lanka. I'm Tamil. I'm from a community that was utterly wiped out by war, by a kind of long, prolonged civil war that essentially destroyed my region. I understand very clearly what it's like to scream into a void while your people are trying to get their story out. And that's what this conversation today will be about. We are happy to take questions. Please type them into the Q&A box and I'll put them to Samuel as we go along. But in the meantime, Samuel, who is currently based in Addis, has reported on Ethiopia for Quartz, the National, Huffington Post, CNN, and the Globe and Mail, has been traveling around the country, and is also the founder of the Everyday Ethiopia hashtag, which tries to illustrate online what a beautiful, incredible, diverse country this really is. Samuel, over to you.
Thank you for the compliment. I'm excited to have been asked to speak to your students. Reuters and Oxford University do have a big legacy. I've watched both from a distance. Reuters when I lived in Canada, and Oxford since I was a child. I had a big shirt that said Oxford, and all I wanted to do was go to Oxford, but I couldn't even go to anywhere close to it. But thank you for the invitation. But if you allow me, I'd like to address some of the criticism I've been getting from social media. I was just in Tigray for the last twice since the conflict began. And I saw the region that I knew from a distance, and which I've visited so many times before the conflict began. And I found a society that's in fear. We no longer call what used to be allegations. There are killings that are happening, rape that's happening all across the state or the region. And all the comments that have been directed at me, I take them to heart. I would like to continue the conversation. We've been trying to tell their story, and we haven't been as successful as we should be. I went with a reporter with the National Geographic to Tigray and visited a number of towns, and with a German TV crew in not just in Mekelle, but in Aksum, Adigrat, and we had a conversation with so many people, and what's happening is overwhelming. It's really, really is sad. You don't have to be from the region to feel the pain of those that have been tweeting, comments, insults, and so on. I don't take any of them personal. I hear you. I try to understand you, but you also have to understand we have limited resources within Ethiopia to report on what's happening. But let us continue the conversation. And again, I'll continue to try my best to tell the story of Ethiopia to the fullest. When I moved back from Canada, I became an Ethiopian journalist, not to make money, but to tell everyday Ethiopian stories. And that's still my dream. And I hope the people you've invited and all the people that have been commenting behind, your tweets, I want them to understand that I really feel their pain, and let us continue the conversation.
Thank you very much, Samuel. And just to clarify to the people who are just joining, what Samuel's talking about is a conversation, a very necessary conversation in Ethiopia, but who gets to tell the story of Tigray. And let me just frame this a little bit about the situation in Ethiopia with journalism, because when the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed took over in 2018, he freed dozens of jailed members of the media. It was part of kind of raft of promised political reforms. Many journalists who had fled the country returned home. There was a real attempt to try and bring in new media laws that brought in independent regulation and protection of sources to bring Ethiopia more in line with other countries in the region, Kenya and South Africa. But in the years since then, what we've seen is a far more worrying trend where legally, other laws designed to stop the spread of hate speech and misinformation have been used to quell dissent. And what we've also started seeing is that Ethiopia is now once again becoming one of the biggest jailers of journalists in the world. And worryingly, journalists in some of the conflict zones in the country have been assassinated. So it's an area where the media freedom was always fragile and it looked like things were improving, and now there's a kind of real sliding backwards. And Samuel, I just want to ask you about this in particular and your reporting. And you have been, you're from Ethiopia and you've lived abroad and you've come back. How safe do you feel in your work, and where do you see the main threats coming from?
Well, most of the time I do feel safe. I write for different publications, not just in Ethiopia, but abroad, as you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation. But, you know, for example, when I traveled to Tigray, what worried me the most was my safety. I didn't feel safe. I just wanted to go back to Addis Ababa. But I was only motivated to move on because of the kind of security that was provided by, for instance, the National Geographic that took me to the Tigray region. But you know, most of the time I do feel safe, but I don't think Ethiopia is going the right direction. I have to be honest, in terms of our work. Many of my colleagues are leaving the profession, joining NGOs, joining the United Nations, and moving to other countries. And that is, you know, a reflection of what has been happening in Ethiopia for the last year. But in 2018, you know, the new prime minister gave us so much hope. We started believing in our profession. I was supposed to go back to Canada. I stayed behind because I really liked what was going on, what was happening in Ethiopia. And as you said, many of my colleagues were freed, and many of the people that left came back to Ethiopia. And again, that was the best year in Ethiopian politics for me and for our profession. But something has changed in the last year that I can't even begin to express within Ethiopia, and that worries all of us.
Can I ask you about the public response to journalists in both Addis and outside the capital? Do you get a sense, because you work for international organizations with international audiences, but within Ethiopia itself, what do you feel is the relationship between the public and journalists? Do you feel that you're trusted, and do you feel that the stories you produce are trusted in the country?
Let me reflect on my work.
I don't mean you, I mean journalists.
Sure.
Yeah.
Let me reflect on my own work with the reporter, the local paper in Ethiopia. My budget for a week was 100 birr, which is about $3 a week. And whenever I used to travel outside of Addis Ababa, I paid from my own pocket. And I mean, I'm a man of privilege. I came from abroad and I have my own resources. But that privilege is only limited to someone like me who came from abroad and who can connect with international audience and get paid enough money to subsidize some of my work within Ethiopia. Many of my colleagues cannot do that. And if you look at the Ethiopian newspapers, for instance, it's always focused on what's happening in Addis Ababa. And that's why I created Everyday Ethiopia, to travel to many countries, many towns and villages within Ethiopia, and try to have a conversation with everyday Ethiopians. But again, on my social media, I reflect on, as you said, the best of Ethiopia. But some of the worst things have happened to me. I was almost stoned in a village. I shouldn't say the place, because all of a sudden I might be attacked because someone might take it personal. But other parts, I was almost killed by a state soldier because of what I was trying to do. And other parts, they saw me as a spying on them. So the challenge remains. I don't think our profession is really being understood by Ethiopians and also the governments. I think what we saw in 2018 was the beginning of a kind of revolution when it came to Ethiopia and our profession. And we've gone back, and again, many of us are moving from the profession, and it's Ethiopia that will ultimately suffer because of what's happening in the country.
Why have things gone backwards? What's happened since 2018?
You know, I was asked to write a column for the Washington Post, and it took me many hours to try to understand what happened.
Yeah, because that's a question that someone from Nigeria has just asked in chat as well. It was on the right track. What snapped?
But Ethiopia was just moving forward, and it did a U-turn without any of us knowing. And it's just worrying for all of us. But you know, there is an election in Ethiopia that gives us a glimpse of hope that something can happen after the election. Whether the election is fair or not is an open question, open debate. But you know, much of the opposition have decided to boycott the election, and we just have to wait and see. Hopefully, it will be a peaceful transition to a new Ethiopia. And again, Ethiopia has, you know, Ethiopia keeps saying it's in a transition. We've been saying it for so many years, and I feel Ethiopia is still in a transition. And many lives are being affected, and the kind of stories we hear and we see whenever we travel outside of Addis Ababa is so overwhelming, especially in places like Tigray.
Talking about 2018 and journalism at that moment where, like you described, there's kind of massive opening up, a massive sense of hope. What were the kind of stories that were being written at the time? And do you think that the media sector could have done things differently to try and kind of capture that sense of hope and hold the government to account more effectively?
I saw many of my colleagues openly discuss the future of Ethiopia. They were even critical of the prime minister, something I've never seen in Ethiopia. And the prime minister was open to the idea of being criticized by the media. And in the last year, even writing a tweet criticizing anyone, him or anyone associated to him, has become a risk for all of us. And that's why many of us have kept quiet. But again, you know, the reasons many of us have come to Ethiopia is because we see some kind of hope. We think Ethiopia will move forward. Ethiopia is not a small country. It has a population of at least 110 million, the youngest population in the world. And we just have to hope. But from our perspective, we just have to tell their stories, not just from based in Addis Ababa, sitting on a 5-star hotel, but going to the actual villages and towns and regions and having a conversation despite the risk that's associated with doing something like this in Ethiopia. We do it because we love what we do and we believe in Ethiopia.
Tell me a little bit about local language reporting. So you're talking about the reporting that's done from journalists in Addis out in the regions, but how much do you see of journalism from the regions, from people from the areas in their own languages as well?
At least 99% of the papers are based in Addis Ababa. When I went to Afar, I saw an Afari newspaper for the first time, and I was shocked. It was a small 8 pages. And it was the first time I've seen a newspaper that's not just in Amharic or not just based in Addis Ababa, but based in Afar, Samhara Afar, and targeting the local population. But I haven't seen any. Whenever I travel, I always go to a store, or if there's a library, I go to the library, mostly in universities, and try to see if they have any local papers, and I've never seen any. Most of them are focused in Addis Ababa and are always in Amharic.
Okay. And do you think this is problematic? Because there's a kind of conversation in Ethiopia, like many countries, about how much is the media, should it be about nation building, and how much should it be about letting smaller communities report on themselves?
I think so. You know, the majority of Ethiopians reside outside of Addis Ababa, and Ethiopia has over 90 different languages. I don't think there should be 90 different languages of newspapers, but the main ones at least should be served. I think that diversity should be captured. It hasn't been captured enough. And I think that's a problem that many of us are beginning to see.
Thank you. I was going to take some of the questions coming in from the question box. One from Mark Olu, one of our journalist fellows who's from Kenya, asking that the Ethiopian media has been openly accused of taking sides in the power wars between Abiy and the Tigray People's Liberation Front. To what extent do you think these biases have affected the working relationships between journalists themselves and how the audience perceive them?
You know, as you've seen the debates on social media, Ethiopian politics remains black and white. You're either with them or against them. And you know, again, I see that. I see many of us are being forced to take sides, but I don't think you can really take sides with, you know, I'm not trying to criticize anyone, but I don't think you can take sides with the TPLF when the government has openly said the TPLF is a terrorist organization. I don't think anyone has taken side with them, not only because of you know, philosophical differences, but I don't think it's safe for anyone to take openly side with anyone.
I suppose I mean, it would be very dangerous to openly be associated with a government, with an organization branded a terrorist organizations, as some journalists do. I don't think that's what Mark meant. I think Mark was talking about the idea of in polarized societies, journalists become part of the polarization. So journalists from one side will only work for publications that support a certain view, and journalists on the other side will only work for publications that support that view. And there is no trust or professional respect between the two sides. And also, crucially, the audiences don't intermingle as well. So if you are from a certain side, you only read that side's media. And so you never get to kind of balanced debate.
I think the trust, that, you know, as long as the trust is involved, I think the public has zero trust with the media. Again, we're not funded well to not be influenced by someone who's willing to dominate us. You know, when I used to work at the Reporter, much of my work was focused, or at least I was pushed to do stories on Chinese interests in the country, for example. You know, the investment, the good things the Chinese are doing. And, you know, because we're not provided the resources, we end up being a PR for anyone, government, opposition, or anyone who's willing to dominate us. So there's always an opening. Again, my budget was less than $3. And if someone brings me a press release that's written well, and and there's a pressure for me to do a news story, I probably would have done it, only because of the kind of environment we're in. But we're easy to be influenced. You know, many forces to influence local journalists, and that's part of the reason why I left. And I'm focused on working for international media that can have the resources for me to do good journalism and not just focus on PR kind of stories that the Ethiopian media is known to do for many, many years, even before Abiy came to power.
I mean, even the international reporting has not covered absolutely everything because, like you said, the resources and access is difficult. But there are concerns that the local media has grossly underreported the human cost of the crisis. And this is the kind of mass killings and torture, starvation, rape. And that in turn has led to a very slow, kind of sluggish global response. It's a question again from Mark. Has the media been shoved into a conspiracy of silence here? Is this a lack of resources, or is there something else going on?
You know, when I worked at the Reporter, we were the largest newspaper in the country, and we were only 40 pages. Half of it was advertisements. And we had very limited space to do all kinds of stories. But I do hear the criticism. I know that we haven't done enough. But again, you know, much of the time, the local media wasn't even allowed to travel to the Tigray state. It was the big media that beat us, that went and did the stories before we were able to go to those parts of Ethiopia. But you also have to know, you know, I know we're focused on Tigray, but this kind of things is happening also everywhere in Ethiopia. With the Oromos, the Amharas, and everyone. It's not just in the Tigray region. And, when I used to work at the Reporter, I showed interest to go and cover Tigray, but they always wanted me to focus on, other stories. They didn't think I had enough knowledge to do local stories, but I did show interest. I wanted to go, and the first chance I got, I did go, and I mean, sad. It's like walking into a Walmart of funeral face, like everyone is sad. It's like a mega town of sad faces everywhere. Whenever you open a conversation, they just cry, and everyone has a story of someone who's either being killed or raped, and it's just so overwhelming. And I think half of the time we ended up, I slept crying and saying, um, what must I do to tell their stories, or whether I should just go back to Canada or do something else. It was depressing, sad, and we no longer call the allegations because, I mean, everyone is saying the same thing, rape accusation. And again, it's an overwhelming story that we need to cover. I want to cover, but again, the people that are pushing me to do this kind of stories also do have to understand the circumstances I am in, not just me, but my colleagues who are based in Ethiopia.
When you say local media are not allowed to travel to the regions, what do you mean by not allowed? Is it permits? Is it
permit? When we asked permits, it was ours wasn't given the attention it needed. The focus was other media, Sky being one, other media that got the permit to go before us. Yes, and something is, I have a funny story. The head of the broadcasting had me suspended from, getting any kind of support from the authority, the broadcasting authority, for asking too many questions at a workshop. He said I challenged him too much, and he felt I was trying to embarrass him in front of, other journalists, and I was suspended from getting services. So he took it personal. But he's left. I think there's a new person as the head of the Ethiopian Broadcasting Authority, and I've seen many positive changes. I've also started going there and having a conversation with them, and they seem to be very helpful.
Okay, so you should be able to find it easier to get out onto the field.
Yes.
Can I ask in particular about the reporting on sexual violence, and then I'll move away from this topic. But I think there's been criticism about the fact that this story about the sexual violence being perpetrated on women in the Tigray region hasn't been highlighted sufficiently. And also what I'd really like to know about is who gets to speak on behalf of these women? Do they speak for themselves? Is someone else speaking for them? How easy is it for a reporter to go and get these stories? Because this is a deeply personal trauma. So there's a balance to be struck between getting the story and also not exploiting women who are already in tremendous pain. I'd be interested to know your experience of this.
Much of Tigray is not accessible, even today. You can go to Mekelle and speak to victims, but getting out of Mekelle is very risky, and you need permits. But the few people that I had a conversation with in Mekelle, especially at the local hospitals, again, sad, just overwhelmingly sad. It's just, it makes you question.
That's kind of my next question. What support are you getting from the international organizations you're working for? Because this is a tremendously difficult story for you on kind of a personal and professional level.
Yeah, international media do give us assignments, and if we're interested, we take it and do the stories. They do pay us well, according to the standard that we've been used to in Ethiopia, but that's all they've been giving us. But again, they do also provide resources, especially transportation money, so we can actually go and fly when we need to and speak to these victims.
Okay. But do you get any kind of support for the emotional toll of reporting?
No, no,
No one's called to check how you are?
no,
Thank
no, zero.
Thank you. A question from Rachel Chitra, a journalist fellow in India, who's interested in a question about, there are a tendency for Western media to view India and African countries as places of poverty, AIDS, and political crises. And Ethiopia in particular has a long history of this, as being portrayed as the country of famine, of needing help. And it's completely at odds to Ethiopia, the country, which is a kind of tremendously proud, independent country with a very long history of being very proud and independent and telling everyone to get lost, basically. But when you pitch stories to the Western media, like the Globe and Mail or CNN, have you felt they're not interested in the nuance, or do you feel like you need to kind of conform to these tropes?
I no longer approach CNN. I don't work for them, but the Globe and Mail and Quartz and the National, they're always focused on current stories. If there is a crisis in Tigray, for instance, they just want to focus on the Tigray region. And I think that's what the editors want. If something appears on CNN, they're most likely are interested. If a famous person mentions, for instance, Tigray or Amhara or Oromo, the issue of Oromo, they're suddenly interested. Besides all this sadness that's going on in Ethiopia, if I pitch a story, for instance, on the family of the weekend and try to interview his family in Addis and around Addis, everyone is interested. So it's a catch-22. Again, they're focused on that tabloidish kind of journalism, and also they react to what they see on mainstream TV. And if President Biden mentions a crisis or a town, they suddenly are interested. And I do get phone calls asking me if I can go to that part of Ethiopia and so on. So I think they work based on interest, how many hits they can get in a story. And I mean, I can understand where they're coming from.
I suppose it's also an issue about agency. When you interview people on the ground, what are you asking them to do? Because part of it is to tell their story framed in a certain way, but part of it is portraying them as agents in their own lives. So they are making choices and decisions for having things done to them, but they're not just sitting and being.
Yeah, when I went to Tigray, for instance, I was prevented from going much of the places that other people were willing to go, foreigners mostly, only because I can only speak Amharic. I'm assumed to be an Amhara, and because I did not speak Tigrinya, there was fear that they might see me as someone spying on the government. And I understood it. I respected it. And I only went to places I was invited in. But that's the new Ethiopia in this era of endless conflicts. We're all always becoming suspicious of each other, and we're becoming our ethnic groups rather than citizens. And that's what worries me and everyone that I deal with, especially those that came back to Ethiopia hoping Ethiopia would suddenly change, become self-sufficient, and be a state where we can have and we can reside in peacefully and contribute and have a happy raise our families and so on. But again, the last year everything has changed. Many of my colleagues have left. It's really sad.
Question from Zoe Ramushu, who's in South Africa and from Zimbabwe, again, one of our journalist fellows. Let's just stay on that kind of happy theme for a moment, which is, you mentioned the year you returned was one of the best for you and the country. What sort of stories were you covering at the time? And what do you think are some of your highlights of that period?
When I was young, I lived in Zambia, and I often traveled to Zimbabwe, Bulawayo, and it was the most beautiful country, and I loved it. But going back to 2018, for example, when Abiy won the Nobel Peace Prize, I stayed up the whole night writing a story for CNN with other colleagues, trying to understand the change and trying to embrace that Ethiopia was finally becoming a country that could earn the Nobel Peace Prize. We had a young prime minister that talked about feminism and human rights and freedom of the media and so on. And I was so excited. Staying up the whole night until the story came out at 11 a.m. As soon as it was announced that he had won, if they had chosen somebody else, my story would have been rejected. But I did not even care. I loved it. I was excited for him, for the country. And again, 2018, 2019, the best years of Ethiopia to me. I know many people say Ethiopia has long history. I don't care about history. I do care about history, but those were the kind of stories I wanted to cover, not just focus on the history, the past, but focused on what was happening in the country, and it was exciting.
And what stories? Tell me one or two stories that you're really proud of having done at that time.
The CNN story was a big highlight. I liked it. I also liked covering stories on the Syrian refugees in Ethiopia that are on the street begging, and because more than 100 years ago, Ethiopia welcomed Armenians, and in my time, my generation were welcoming the Syrians to our country. I loved covering their stories, having a conversation with them, visiting their restaurants and having shawarma with them. And I liked, the story came out in the National in UAE. I was excited. Ethiopia was has always opened her arms to refugees from from South Sudan and Somalia, Eritrea, and so on. But we are beginning to have, other refugees from Syria and other countries. And I was excited telling their story, because Ethiopia is, again, has to continue to be a generous nation that do welcome other people as well as the way Canada welcomed me and my family.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Sita Chakravarti, who's again a journalist from India with us, and she reports a great deal on Kashmir. And she just wanted to talk about, you talked about not using the term allegations anymore when you go and report on atrocities in the region. And in conflict situations, it's often hard to get official responses to these allegations. So when do you decide you will report on the local accounts of what happened without the caveat of allegations?
Whenever the UN confirms, the UN has too many problems, but again, it's the best institution, well respected, well resourced. I rely on the UN, especially when I quote numbers. Amnesty International, again, I respect Amnesty International, again, has issues, allegations on its own. Human Rights Watch, the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, led by Dr. Daniel Bekele, highly educated and smart guy who needs resources to investigate more. I hear the criticism that are coming in. But I listen to those people. And also, whenever the government speaks, I listen to them as well, because they are the Ethiopian government. And there are many sources we rely on, but these are the few organizations that I tend to use, and use their numbers to justify on what's happening on everywhere in Ethiopia.
Okay, and how do you gain the trust of these communities in the conflict zone enough for them to tell you their stories and trust that you'll do the right thing with that?
Well, Addis is a big town, but it's also a very small town. I meet them after hours. I have beer with them. I drink with them. I invite them whenever there's a birthday in my family. They invite me, and I tend to build a personal relationship and trust with many of them. Even Daniel Bekele, I've known through social media. I've connected with him. I've spoken to him. Again, we need those type of people to come to Ethiopia and work in Ethiopian institutions. His story came out in Reuters not too long ago, describing how much he gets paid, less than $200 a day. A month, with no benefits. But it goes to show you how much public all these people are interested in helping Ethiopia advance, move forward. When I worked in at the Reporter, I was paid around the same amount of money, and it wasn't about money for us. It was about making a contribution to Ethiopia.
Okay, and I think also the question is, how do you gain the trust of the communities in the conflict zones? So in the Amara region or in Tigray, how do you gain their trust? Because as you said, often the suspicion is that you are a spy from the capital.
Yep.
So how does that interaction work?
We take local fixers.
Yeah.
Mostly, we use fixers. If we have enough resources, we also hire a translator, an independent translator, and then we bring what has been translated for us, and then we have it rechecked by somebody else to make sure that there's no personal interest in the story, and what was said has been translated correctly with no outside interest, and that's how we work on it. But we rely on fixers most of the time.
Okay, so it is interesting. So there's always a conversation about fixers. International news agencies using fixers on the ground, and fixers are really they're just journalists on the ground.
Yes,
it's interesting. It's the second tier where that happens. Let's talk about press freedom. Stay on this media freedom, because Ethiopia is the third most notorious sub-Saharan African country after Eritrea and Cameroon for jailing journalists, and this is called into the Committee to Protect Journalists. And are there collaborative efforts by the local media houses or civil society to push back against this? This is not a good place to be for the headquarters for a country that hosts the African Union.
Yes. 2019, when Ethiopia hosted UNESCO, it was celebrated as a country that had 0 journalists in prison.
Yeah.
There are many organizations.
UNESCO hosted the kind of World Press Freedom Day in Ethiopia in 2019.
Yes. But again, there are too many organizations that are fighting for the interests of Ethiopian journalists. But again, they have more passion rather than professional, interest in what we do. You see them, maybe you hear about them maybe once every other year, focusing on what has been happening with Ethiopian journalists and those that have been imprisoned and so on. But many of them are really quiet because of all kinds of pressure that has been coming to them, and they focus on basically giving basic workshops for us rather than speaking up on what's happening with many of my colleagues.
What kind of pressures do you mean there?
There's a political interest. There's also public pressure, saying as soon as they speak out, they're always accused of supporting, one side rather than being loyal to Ethiopia, as they're beginning to say. So it's a really catch-22 for many of them. But there are many young, gifted journalists that are leaving the profession and joining UN-like organizations, making good money and not looking back on what even showing no interest in coming back and becoming an Ethiopian journalist, because again, it doesn't pay well. There's a lack of security for us. Whenever we speak on a subject, we're always accused of being siding with someone that we are not. We're just trying to tell a story, and we reside in a country that has misunderstanding on what we do. Not too long ago, Ethiopia locked many of people like me and charging them with terrorism. So as Ethiopia moves back to that era, it scares all of us and looks at and forces us to reflect on what we do, and if there is another way we can contribute rather than being a journalist is an option we're all studying on a regular basis.
Question from Adele Santelli, who's from Brazil, again, one of our journalist fellows. Is there any kind of support that would help from the international community, from other journalists outside the country? What would help you?
What would help me is if I become a fellow at your Reuters. But I think, again, I've left local journalism. I'm focused on international assignments. Yeah. I get paid enough. But there are many colleagues that are earning maybe $100 or $200 a month and struggling to tell stories. I think they need more support than myself.
Okay, thank you. That's, yeah, straightforward answer. how much of a problem is self-censorship amongst journalists? So it's not the state telling them not to report, they just decide it's not worth the pressure to deal with this.
Well, I am one of those people that have been criticized of not speaking up on all kinds of things that are happening in Ethiopia. Am I self-censoring myself? Yes.
Okay.
I live in Ethiopia. I live in Ethiopia. Again, when I lived in Canada, I used to look at the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, challenging the premier, which we call premier governor, and the prime minister. And there's a system where if the person or the prime minister doesn't tell you a story or it gives you information, there's a system where you go and challenge him. And then he's forced to give, there's a system. But in Ethiopia, there's no system. There's no, if I don't know, if a minister refuses to speak to you, or if the Ethiopian Broadcasting Authority suspends you because I asked too many questions at the workshop, there's no system where I can go and challenge him because he is more powerful than I am. I just move forward. And that's the working life of Ethiopians.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much for that answer. Going to go to social media and the online presence. There's two questions I have. One is from Elizabeth Gampel from Germany, asking about how important is social media for your work as a journalist? And the related question I have is, do you feel that in a media environment that's very highly controlled and where journalists don't always have the ability, funds, or willingness to put themselves on the, out there, that social media provides an alternative space for these voices and these stories?
To me, social media has been the most powerful tool. I joined social media a few weeks after I came back from North Korea in 2018, and I was semi-detained, and I wanted to tell the story. I was excited, but my social media was blocked, and I was forced to start a different Twitter account. I had Getachew S, so I was forced to have another one, Getachew SS. But it's almost like my networking channel where I have conversation with all kinds of people. I get all kinds of comments, especially my DM, insults, sometimes opportunities. I don't insult them back. Some of my closest friends are the people that began insulting me, and then we became friends, and we go out, we have drinks, and we talk. They tell me their story, I tell them my story, and then we try to find something that we have in common, because we all are we have many years ahead of us, and we want to see Ethiopia move forward. But I've used it to the best of my ability. Sometimes people misunderstand my social media accounts because sometimes I dance. I don't know how to dance, but I just move around pretending to dance. Whenever I go to different parts of Ethiopia, I try to dress the way the people dress, and then try to have a conversation with them. When I went to Afar, I slept with the nomads, and we had a long conversation the whole night, and that was a gift. I mean, I could have stayed at a five-star, what they consider a five-star hotel in Afar, but I really wanted to stay with them and connect with them and tell their story on my social media, and I loved it. Again, I've used it. I've connected with so many people. Your request to appear on this program, audience came through social media. So it's an important. It has been very important to me, and it continues to produce results to the kinds of work I want to do in Ethiopia. As long as I'm allowed to perform or work in journalism in Ethiopia, I would like to continue doing that. I love Ethiopia. Not just, Addis is a fine town. It's a big town. But sometimes it's a town of concretes. There's no green space. It's there are many few places where you can have space for yourself. That's why I tend to go outside of Addis and have a conversation with all kinds of people, and that's what you see on my social media reflected on.
Okay, thank you. I come back to that, but you mentioned North Korea. Can you just tell me what happened there?
I was in North Korea in 2017.
Yeah.
I went to the embassy. They invited me, and I went. I went through China and took Air Koryo. It was moving like this, and I was like, I didn't know what was happening. And then as soon as we crossed out of the Chinese airspace, they started playing military music, and I went, and they searched my bag, and the only thing they found was a Time magazine, and they looked at every page and checked everything, and then I was given the green light to get out of the airport and go to my hotel. So they had me go different areas of North Korea, and again with limited conversations with everyday people that I really wanted to have. But again, it was an experience. But at the end, I was asked to pay them. So I paid so I can be let go out of North Korea. But I look at my experience in North Korea and even Eritrea. I was on the first flight when when this new engagement began, and I remember the happiness and the excitement. In North Korea, to me, while I was a bit concerned when I was being asked for to provide money to, I don't know who I was paying, but I was paying someone who was working with the government. I was a bit concerned, but again, I liked it, and it was the highlight of my journalism career in Ethiopia.
These are these tours that North Korea did organize at one point for journalists, where you get taken on a kind of very restricted tour.
But this was all by myself.
Yeah.
But I had tour guides.
Yes.
Tour guides.
We're always sent to follow you. Yes, exactly. Thank you. Going back to social media and the Everyday Ethiopia hashtag, which you said you created to get a sense of the country. What kind of reception have you had for it? And does it earn you any money? Does anyone pay you for it, or do you get anything from?
No, I've never been paid for any of my posting on social media. I've been offered. I haven't accepted any money. But Everyday Ethiopia makes zero money. I have never been paid for it. But some of the criticism is sometimes I go to a 5-star hotel or a nice hotel, and I have, for example, a salmon or an expensive dish, and I used to post all kinds of food, and people would write me saying, you live in a poor country and you're not supposed to show that side of Ethiopia. You're supposed to focus on this and that, and everyone has his or her own issues that do want me to highlight, and I try to do that. But I also want to show all sides of Ethiopia, including the 5-star hotels. But that's the criticism I get. But I see all this criticism as having an impact on the conversation that's happening in Ethiopia, and I've begun to take my posting more seriously than before. And it's being reflected more. And I no longer post any kind of food, and I have limited the dancing stuff because of what's happening all across Ethiopia with the crisis, the conflicts.
I mean, who else do you recommend people should follow? Which Ethiopian journalists do you think would you recommend people follow on social media in particular?
Samson Brahani is a young journalist. He's the head of the biggest business newspaper in the country, Addis Fortune. There's Dawit Ndeshaw. He's a Reuters correspondent. There's Sisai Sahalu, who writes for the Reporter. He replaced me at the Reporter. I made sure that I was being replaced by a young gifted young journalist, and there are too many. There are many people that do care about Ethiopia and write vital information for the country on their social media, and all the young people that I mentioned, do all that and more.
Thank you very much. Now we've got 10 minutes left. I just want to go look ahead at the elections, which were going to be on June the 5th, but I think now have been postponed till June the 21st. Some opposition parties in the Oroma region have decided to boycott the elections, but not all. So how much do you feel that this will still be an election with real potential for change? And in particular, can you speak about the journalism and the misinformation space around the election reporting? Are journalists able to report accurately? And in particular, the government has now set up the Ethiopia State of Emergency Fact Check Unit, where the government has itself decided to be a fact checker for content, not just on Tigray, but other national issues. Do you support this, or is this another kind of way of controlling information?
I support a government that's beginning to be engaged. And if this is their version of an engagement, good for them. But even for us, when we report on what's happening in Ethiopia, we always tend to call the Prime Minister's office or his PR. If they don't respond, we go to their social media, and this is one of the social media we do go to and get any kind of reaction for our stories. But the Ethiopian election was postponed from last year because of COVID, according to the government. It's postponed once again, and it's expected to happen in a few weeks. As you mentioned, there are many political groups that have boycotted this election. The Oromo being one, and there's also others, including Jawar Mohammed, an American young, passionate, often controversial figure that wanted to run for office. He was in the process, as he said, trying to give up his American citizenship and retain an Ethiopian citizenship just in time for him to run. There's also Iskandar Nega, who is he wanted to run for mayor of Addis. He is in prison. There's also another one, Getachew, who is in the U.S. There are very few actors that are fewer actors that are participating in this election. And I think for Ethiopians, I'm not sure if it's going to be the most democratic election in Ethiopia. To begin with, democracy has a very low standard in Ethiopia, so I don't know. But I think people want to move on. I think they just, even if this election produces the status quo, they just want the most basic things to be given to them, which is their security. There are many, many people that reside in Ethiopia in fear. And they just want this election to be over, and hopefully the government would give them the kind of security that they do need to provide their citizens. Because again, there are too many people living in fear and too many people dying all across Ethiopia, not just in Tigray, but all across Ethiopia. But Tigray, I understand it's a highlight. I'm not trying to discount what's happening in the Tigray state region, I mean.
In the next few weeks, you must have quite a lot of reporting projects planned. How confident are you that you'll be able to report relatively freely and safely on the elections and the campaign leading up to it?
80% of the time, I think I'll be safe. It's a 20% that worries me. But again, I do want to tell the Ethiopian story. I always tend to, I don't know if you guys know Brian Stewart, a CBC reporter based in Toronto. He retired 10 years ago. In 1984, he came to Ethiopia in Tigray region, I'm sorry. And then he was in Ethiopia during the Ethiopian famine. And he interviewed he saw this young lady about to die, and he begged the nurses to save her life. And then he became her guardian, and she became a nurse. So I like that kind of story, telling the faces and the voices behind the numbers. Whenever we hear of Ethiopian stories from outside, we're always given numbers. 1,000 people have died, 5 million people are starving, or that kind of stuff. And I've always liked telling the story and giving faces. And that's what I plan to do in this election and far beyond.
Thank you very much, Samuel. Thank you for your time, and thank you so much all for your questions as well. It's been a really illuminating hour, and I wish you and your colleagues and Ethiopia all the best of everything, and we'll be watching your work and all the stories coming out in the coming weeks. Next week, thank you. Next week, we have Jessica Hamzalu from the New Scientist magazine, who's going to talk to us about her experience as a biomedic reporter covering COVID-19, the ups and downs and the lessons learned of reporting on what turned out to be the front line of journalism. So do join us then, and also sign up to our newsletter and follow us on Twitter. And in the meantime, Samuel, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. See you.
You all.